Hi guys, I am back and we are going to continue on with the next chapter in the book of Genesis, chapter 16. Now chapter 16 is about Hagar and the birth of Ishmael. And you're going to learn who these people are. So the first section and this is where the stories start getting really interesting. I love the book of Genesis so far, but this is where it really starts picking up and getting interesting. So Sarai gives her servant girl Hagar to Abram, and we'll find out why. So Sarai, which is Abram's wife, who turns to Abraham, that's Abraham and Sarah, right? Okay. Sarai, or Sarah with maybe the eyes, I don't really know. Maybe I'm saying it wrong. It's Sarah or Sarai, I don't know. Unless the eyes, but if you guys know, let me know. I actually have not looked that up. So the first section, like I said, of this chapter 16, Sarah, we're just going to say Sarah. Sarah gives her servant girl Hagar to Abram. So Hagar is Sarah's servant girl. Okay, so we're going to start in the first two verses of chapter 16. And verse 1 and 2 talks about how Sarah proposes a child for Abram through Hagar because she wanted him to have a child. So 1 and 2 says, "Now Sarah, Abram's wife, bare him no children, and she had a handmaid, an Egyptian, whose name was Hagar. And Sarah said unto Abram, Behold now, the Lord hath restrained me from bearing. I pray thee, go in unto my maid," which means have relations with her. "It may be that I may obtain children by her." And Abram hearkened to the voice of Sarah. So God promised, in verse 1, God promised that he would, that Abram would have many descendants. Okay, verse 2, or chapter 12, verse 2 in the book of Genesis. And that she had an Egyptian maidservant named Hagar. So Hagar was part of what Abram received during his time in Egypt, when he was in Egypt. And that's back in chapter 12, verse 16. And if you guys don't remember it, let's go back real quick. And chapter 12, verse 16. Because it says, and he entreated Abram well for her sake, and he had sheep and oxen and asses and men servants and maid servants and she asses and camels. And the Lord plagued Pharaoh in his home with great plagues because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. And Pharaoh called to Abram and said, What is this that thou hast done unto me? Why didn't they tell me that she was his wife? So remember, back in chapter 12 is whenever they went into Egypt, re-entered into Egypt, and he told Sarah, because of her beauty, you have to pretend that if you can, pretend that you are my sister. All right, so in verse 2 where it says, the Lord has restrained me from bearing children. So Sarah understood that God was sovereign over the womb. But there was a lot of pain in her words because all she ever wanted to do was have a child, her and Abraham both. In the book of Proverbs, chapter 13, verse 12, the pain of hope deferred, making the heart sick. The pain of prayers not yet answered. The pain of arms that never held her own child. The pain of public shame. The pain of blaming God for one's problems. Unbelief is a sin. Did you know that? That unbelief is a sin. And one that carries a lot of pain. And that's all in references in Proverbs chapter 13, verse 12. And then it says, Please go to my maid. Perhaps I shall obtain children by her. Well, Sarah encouraged Abram to take part in that day, essentially a surrogate mother, is what we call it today, arrangement. And according to custom, the child would be considered to be the child of Abram and Sarah, not Abram and Hagar. So, Sarah could justify this as a way to fulfill God's promise. Nevertheless, this was against God's will for many reasons. It was a sign of unbelief in God and his promises. And Sarah believed in God's I can't ever say that word, sovereignty over the womb, then acted against it. And it was a sin against God's plan for marriage. And it was a sin against Abram and Sarah's marriage. That this surrogacy wasn't done in a doctor's office, but in a bedroom. So Abram heeded the voice of Sarah. You know, Sarah was tormented by the thought of maybe my husband would be better off without me. It was bad for Sarah to hold on to that thought. And it was much more worse for Abram to heed the voice of Sarah on this matter. All right, next is verse 3 and verse 4, and it talks about how Abram agrees with Sarah's suggestion. Verse 3 and 4 says, "And Sarah, Abram's wife, took Hagar their maid, the Egyptian, after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan, and gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife. And he went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her eyes." So in verse 3, where it says Sarah took Hagar and gave her to Abram to be his wife. So they each acted according to unbelief. They both did. Abram did not actually marry Hagar, but he acted toward her as a man should only act toward his wife. And after Abram dwelt 10 years in the land, it had been more than 10 years since the promise was made regarding Abram's descendants. Okay? And that's what that means. From the time that they made the covenant, it was 10 years since the promise was made regarding Abraham's descendants. Abram and Sarah were discouraged enough that they approached the problem on their own by leaving God out of it. And, you know, this was wrong for many reasons, okay? Men and women of faith must walk in faith and not unbelief, which is what they were doing at this time. And the long wait discouraged them and made them act in the flesh. And that's what we do today. You know, we don't want that long wait. We want it, and we want it now, right? Well, the long wait that for God's promise discouraged Abram and Sarah. And so they made the foolish act in the flesh, which is what we tend to do. Even then, it would still be more than 13 years until the child of the promise came. So they had it's already been 10 years. They already have another 13 to go before they had a child. But God has a plan. This is why you have to be patient. Let God work out his plan. So next, when he said, so he went into Hagar and she conceived. So Abram acted on his own power when he agreed to impregnate Hagar. And what he did not do is he did not trust God's ability to provide an heir through Sarah. But this wasn't a matter of romance. According to some of the customs of the day, Hagar would actually sit on the lap of Sarah as Abram impregnates her to show that the child would legally belong to Sarah. And you can also see a reference to that in Genesis chapter 30 verse 3. Let's go because and look at that real quick. It says, and she said, behold, my maid Bilhah, go into her, and she shall bear upon my knees, that I may also have children by her. But then again, this is talking about in Genesis. That was Genesis, right? You know, that's talking about the custom of that day, even though this is not talking. This is talking about Bilhah and Jacob and Rachel. But it's the custom during that day. So that's what that was referring to. Could it be that this is what happened about sitting on Sarah's lap? And then she conceived. So from Sarah's perspective, a terrible thing happened. Abram succeeded in making Hagar pregnant, and this proved beyond all doubt the failure to provide a son to Abram was the fault of Sarah and not her husband. So that was in Sarah's perspective, and Sarah was very upset over it. She thought it was her and not Abram. So when she conceived, her mistress became despised in her eyes, and that's what it says in verse 4. Hagar immediately began to think of herself as better and greater than Sarah. And a bad situation eventually became worse. All right, let's go on to continue on to verse 5 and verse 6. And verse 5 and verse 6 talks about how Sarah's anger is toward Hagar. So 5 and 6 says, "And Sarah said unto Abram, My wrong be upon thee. I have given my maid unto thy bosom. And when she saw that she had conceived, I was despised in her eyes. The Lord judge between me and thee. But Abram said unto Sarah, Behold, thy maid is in thy hand. Do to her as it pleaseth thee. And when Sarah dealt hardly with her, she fled from her face." So in verse 5 where it says, "My wrong be upon thee." So what Sarah means is that Sarah blamed the whole situation on Abram. He should have acted as the spiritual leader and told his wife that God was able to perform what he promised, and they didn't need to try to perform God's promise by disobeying him and relying on man's strength and wisdom. So she's now trying to put all the blame off on Abram because Sarah was very upset. Because it says, "I became despised in her eyes." And so what this means that Hagar's contempt for Sarah started the problem. She couldn't resist displaying an inappropriate haughtiness, thinking her pregnancy somehow showed her to be better than Sarah because, haha, I got pregnant, you didn't. And that's what Hagar was pretty much doing. And in verse 6 where it says the maid is in... Did I spell that wrong? Hold on, I'm sorry. Thy maid is in thy hand, yes. Thy maid is in thy hand, do to her as you please. And so what Abram is saying is, Abram seemed to make a bad situation worse by turning the situation over to Sarah after she blamed him. And for not taking care of the child he was the father to. He also put his relationship with Sarah first, and that was good. It is much easier to live life trusting in and obedient unto the Lord. And when Sarah dealt harshly with her, she fled from her presence. So what that means is that Sarah's cruelty collided with Hagar's pride. And all Hagar could think to do was to run. Even with nowhere to go, she ran. And she fled. And probably she fled back to Egypt, which is her original home. So the next section of the chapter talks about how Hagar flees from Abram and Sarah. And we'll start in verse 7 through 9. And verse 7 through 9 talks about the angel of the Lord appears to Hagar and instructs her. And 7 through 9 says, "And the angel of the Lord found her by a fountain of water in the wilderness, by the fountain in the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, Sarah's maid, whence comest thou, and whither wilt thou go? And she said, I flee from the face of my mistress Sarah. And the angel of the Lord said unto her, I will multiply thy seed exceedingly, that it shall not be numbered for multitude." I'm sorry. I totally read wrong. In verse 9 it says, "And the angel of the Lord said unto her, Return to thy mistress, and submit thyself under her hands." Can you only imagine? So, Hagar's escape led her to a spring. And the angel of the Lord was possibly a physical presence who spoke with Hagar as one person speaks to another. You can reference that you can also reference in the book of John, chapter 1, verse 18, and the book of 1 Timothy, chapter 6, verse 16. Because in different, the angel of the Lord appears, right? The angel of the Lord would appear later to Abraham, which is in Genesis chapter 22. The angel of the Lord appears to Moses in Exodus chapter 3. The angel of the Lord appears to Balaam in Numbers 22. Appears to Israel collectively in Judges chapter 2. The angel of the Lord appears to Gideon in Judges chapter 6. The angel of the Lord appears to Samson's parents. Book of Judges chapter 13. Appears to David, 2 Samuel chapter 24, and appears to Elijah in 1 Kings chapter 19. So this is the first appearance of the angel of the Lord in the Bible. The very first appearance. And when it said, he said, Hagar, where have you come from and where are you going? So the angel of the Lord asked a very important and insightful question. In Hagar's pride and misery, she acted without thinking. And that's what we all do today. In Hagar's pride and misery, we have pride and misery. That's why we do a lot of acting without thinking first. And I'm even guilty of that. And in 9, return to your mistress and submit yourself under her hand. So the angel of the Lord is telling her, repent. Go back and submit to your maid, which is Sarah. All right, in verse 10 through 12, talks about the promise of the angel of the Lord to Hagar. And verse 10 through 12 says, and the angel of the Lord said unto her, I will multiply thy seed exceedingly, that if thou shalt not be numbered for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said unto her, behold, thou art with child, and shalt bear a son, and shalt call his name Ishmael, because the Lord hath heard thy affliction. And he will be a wild man. His hand will be against every man, and every man's hand against him. And he shall dwell in the presence of all of his brothers. And so in verse 10, where it says, I will multiply your descendants exceedingly. So God not only implied a promise of protection, he also gave a clear promise of a staggering blessing. The unborn son of Hagar would be the father of uncountable descendants. As the promise was fulfilled, Ishmael became the ancestor, later on, of the Arab people, just as his later half-brother Isaac would become the ancestor of the Jewish people. So you have Ishmael and you have Isaac. And Ishmael became the ancestor of the Arab people, and Isaac became the ancestor of the Jewish people. Pretty interesting, huh? And in verse 11, where it says, you shall call his name Ishmael. So Ishmael was given a great promise, and not only in the number of his descendants, but also in that he was the first one in the Bible given his name before he was born. God had a plan for this boy and his descendants. Not only for him, but his descendants. God doesn't give a name if he doesn't have a plan. So they sent the angel of the Lord. And where it says, you shall call him Ishmael, because the Lord has heard your affliction. So basically, the name Ishmael means God will hear. H-E-A-R, hear. And in verse 12, where it says, he shall be a wild man. So the life of Hagar's son Ishmael would not be easy. And that's what he's telling him. but God would still look over him and sustain him and keep him safe. Remember that the ill effect of this is that a wild man, his hand shall be against every man, and every man's hand against him, has been mostly seen in violence and murder among the Arabs themselves. All right, the last two verses in chapter 16, verse 13 through 16, and those two verses talks about God's blessing and protection of Hagar and Ishmael. 13 through 16 says, "And she called the name of the Lord that spoke unto her, Thou God seest me. For she said, Have I also here looked after him that seeth me? Wherefore the well was called Bir Laharali, Bir Lahai Roi. Behold, it is between Kadesh and Bered. And Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram called his son's name, which Hagar bore, Ishmael. And Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram." So in verse 13 it says, "You are the God who sees." Hagar knew this was no mere angel who appeared to her. The angel of the Lord was also the God who sees, the same one watching over Hagar and yet to be born Ishmael. Hagar bore Abram and son. Hagar did return with a submitted heart. She told the whole story to Abram and Sarah. And Abram named the child Ishmael. And you can also see the book of Matthew chapter 28 verse 20. All right, that's it for chapter 16. Thanks, guys.